Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is part one of a lecture on Aristotle on the soul, and you can find part two on this channel as well. So we want to begin with just a couple of questions. And we begin, as Aristotle would, by just looking out into the world. It's the same, some things that we might see in the world would be a purple pepper, a cat, a bear, and a child. And so one of the questions we might ask is, how do all of these different things exist? But even on top of that, we might look out in the world and we might see that there are different kinds of bears, or even different individuals of the same bear kindness. Just as we might also see that there are three different kinds of human beings. So there's a child, and there's a Professor Nicholas, and there's some actor doing something on a screen. And so we have both the question of how are there different kinds of things, and how are there different numbers of the same kind of thing. And this is a question that really Western philosophy began with. How do multiple things exist? And that question went alongside the question of how do things change? And so we're asking fundamental philosophical questions. What distinguishes kinds of things, and what distinguishes individuals of different kinds? And that will be how we address the soul, at least from the perspective of Aristotle. So here's a little bit of information about Aristotle. But if you want more information, I invite you to watch my lecture on Aristotle on this channel. It's Nicomachean Ethics, Part 1, Aristotle, and I'll go into, in that lecture, a little bit about Aristotle in more depth than what you see here. For the purposes of this lecture, we're just going to move on to some more background for what Aristotle is trying to do and why the concept of the soul is important for him. So, Aristotle, as you might know, was the student of Plato. He actually studied for 20 years with Plato, so that's a fairly long time to study. Took me about 9 years to get my PhD, so Aristotle had a couple of PhDs by the time he graduated. And his philosophy develops out of a reaction and an engagement with Aristotle. So his problem, if we want to state it that way, is how to keep Plato's insights while correcting for problems, and particularly insights about being and change. So one of the central ideas here for Plato is the idea of the transcendental forms. You might also hear these labeled ideas, but it's the idea, the case for Plato that these forms or ideas are separated from experience and appearance, and appearance and experience are degraded manifestations of these forms. Matter for Plato is just a stuff. It's not really important because it doesn't really have a lot of reality to it. So for Plato, there's a gulf between form and matter. And if you know much about the history of philosophy, you know this comes back again with St. Augustine. Augustine was a follower of Plato and Plotinus, and he accepted this kind of dualism. And it also comes back again with Descartes. Descartes would be the modern defender of dualism. And we can think about Plato's example as a sort of radical dualism, and he relies on a demiurge that holds these the forms together. So that's some background from Plato and how this feeds into Aristotle's question. So how do we keep some of these insights about form and matter without some of the problems? And so for Aristotle, Plato faced a couple of problems, and we're going to look at four of them. The first problem is extravagance. For Plato, there's a form for whatever something has in common with another. So there's not only a form for, say, bear and a form for human, but there would be a form for mammal because we have that in common, right? So things like relatives would have forms for Plato. So forms tend to multiply under Plato's understanding of philosophy. A form has something in common with a particular thing sharing in it, so there would be a form for the particular sharing in form. So the bear has the shares in the form of bear. All the individual bears are sharing somehow in this form of bear, which is the most real bear. And then there would be a form of that sharing in form, and so this you can see can get very complicated. Aristotle also said that Plato's philosophy was inefficient. Uh, he said forms cannot be causes if they are not part of the caused thing. So Plato's trying to talk about how things change, what causes that, and he uses forms to make his arguments, but forms themselves do not change. So for Aristotle, this becomes problematic. How can a form of a bear explain the change from a baby bear to a live bear to a dead bear? Forms also are unknowable. So most of us believe that knowledge comes from perception. And Plato differed from that. He said knowledge really comes from our mind or from reason apart from perception. Uh, so the forms are not knowable for Aristotle because they're not perceptible. Uh, for Plato, they're knowable, but only for a select few, those who can practice philosophy and meditate. And then finally, you may have guessed this one. It seems unintelligible because we're talking about a sharing in. So all of these bears out in the woods share in the form of bear. What does that actually mean if the form is separate from the bear? So these are four problems that Aristotle has with Plato's forms, and they're going to lead him to develop his own conception of form and matter and how those relate. So a way to get around to what Aristotle's trying to do is to think about what an artist is doing, right? Um, Perhaps you've had a class in art, or you might be an artist yourself, or if you've written a novel. But the first thing that an artist does is come up with an idea. There's an idea for some. There would be an image in the artist's head. I've heard artists talk about sculpting, and they see the object in the clay or in the wood, and they have to bring that object out. So the artist has the idea and then paints or draws or sculpts or chisels away at the wood and produces the actual thing. So Aristotle wants to use this analogy to kind of help us to think about form and matter. And you probably can guess what his answer is going to be here. He wants to say that the form is what makes this thing the kind of thing it is. So if we go back to here, the icon of St. Nicholas and the artist wants to make an icon of St. Nicholas, and then he makes it. So the idea is in the artist's head, and the icon itself here is um, the the thing that it is because of the idea that it has. But the idea is not something out here in the world, something out here that's more real than the thing. The idea for Aristotle is right here in the thing itself. So form or idea is what makes the thing the kind of thing it is. If we're talking about bears, then each bear has the form inside of it. And so what are we talking about then when we talk about bears and human beings and trees and those sorts of things? What we're talking about is this substance. A substance is this or that particular existing thing. Now again, if you've had some more modern philosophy, particularly with Descartes, you might understand substance differently. So for Descartes, there are two substances. There's matter and mind. And you might remember Descartes famous for saying, I think, therefore I am. He's pointing out there that his substance is really his mind and the body is something separate from him. But he's thinking of mind as a substance in itself and the body as a substance. For Aristotle, that's not right. The substance is this or that particular thing. So this bear, this tree, this whatever. And what makes it this thing is in part the form, right? It's this kind of thing. This bear in front of me is a bear because it has the form of bear in it. And what individuates, what makes that bear different from that bear, is not the form, but matter itself, or what Aristotle would call prime matter. I don't want to get too complicated here, but prime matter is what everything is made of. It doesn't have any form in itself. It's sort of the best analogy is to think about clay or Play-Doh that you've played with before, and then you turned it into a snake or a bear if you're very good at it. Um, and you might make several bears out of the same Play-Doh or clay. Well, that the clay is the idea behind prime matter, and each bear shares in the form of a bear. You might have a standing bear and a running bear and different kinds of bears, but they're all bears because they have this same form that you've given them. That is, you've given the Play-Doh that you've played with. So to kind of make this a little bit better, we have a picture of Coco the cat here. Coco is a substance, right? It's this cat, Coco the cat. And Coco is the cat that she is, because she has the form of catness, and she shares that form with other cats, only in the sense that uh, we can look at each of these cats and say, hey, that's a cat, and that's a cat, and that's a cat. Snowflake the cat is black and looks a little bit different than Coco. And we can look at other cats and see that they're different, and yet they're all cats. Now, in modern science, we don't want to get too lost here. We might talk about the species. And Aristotle, as you might know, developed the idea of species and genus. And so our whole taxonomy of the natural world arises from Aristotle's studies in science. So if you go back, if you hadn't had a chance to go back and look at my lecture on Aristotle, one of the things that I emphasize there is that he is a scientist before he is a philosopher. And so his science informs his philosophy. Uh, what makes Coco different from, say, Fluffy or Snowflake is that Coco is catness in this specific spatiotemporal matrix, right? There's something, the fleshiness of Coco here, that makes her this cat and not that cat. Uh, so Aristotle's answer to what things are begins with this idea of substance, and form and matter come to make this substance what it is, Coco the cat. Now, it's very important to emphasize that form and matter can never be separated. So this is a clear distinction between Aristotle and Plato, or between Aristotle and Descartes. For both Plato and Descartes, form can exist separately, matter can exist separately. Aristotle says no, matter and form only exist together. So it's not a substance dualism. It's what philosophers have come to call hylomorphism. So things change. That's the morph here. The stuff, the matter changes, right? Because it goes from one form to another. So we'll talk a little bit in lecture 2 about immortality. But for those of us who are Christian, what this means is that our souls, because the trick here is that the form is going to end up being the soul. For living beings, our soul cannot exist apart from our bodies. And we'll talk a little bit about how that has come out to play in other philosophers. So to talk about this bear and that bear and this cat and that cat or that tree is to talk about matter organized in a particular way. So again, as an analogy, we can think about the genetic code of a particular animal, organizing it as this kind of animal. And we can even talk about the genetic code making it Coco here and Mittens here and Snowflake there as different cats, because they have different genetic code. But the genetic code, of course, is, as we know, matter itself. And so it has its own form in a certain sense. And so we don't want to get too caught up in this idea about form and matter and relating it to the genetic code. The simple idea here is that we've through science understood what Aristotle's been talking about, and it verifies much of what Aristotle says. So to finish up part 1 of this lecture, then we want to just go back and look at Aristotle versus Plato. Aristotle makes form more concrete by focusing on the substance. So remember, for Plato, the forms exist out in the ether. For Plato, they're more real, but Aristotle says that doesn't seem like a lot of sense. We can't really experience them. We don't have any perception of them. The form is what is in this or that substance. It also explains our experience, and it helps us to explain change, and that would be a totally different lecture if we wanted to get into that. And finally, it avoids the big question about how does the spirit and the body interact. For Aristotle, the forum is part of the body. So that ends lecture one.